All right, it's about time we revisit the coil versus air topic. I've made this video before a couple years ago. People didn't seem to like what I ended up preferring. I preferred the air shock, and based on the comments, you would have thought I had insulted everyone's mother. So let's revisit this.
Wow.
So this time around, we have a new bike. We have a Yeti SB160. We also have new suspension components. We have the Rockshox Vivid and a Super Deluxe coil. So this SB160 should be a little bit better for this test because it's a bit better suited for a coil than the bike I used previously. You know, this is a pretty big burly bike. We've got 160 millimeters of travel to work with, so we're putting big burly suspension components on it. And that would make sense. I mean, you're not really gonna put a coil on a 120 mil trail bike anyway. The leverage curve on this bike is moderately progressive, but it does ramp up pretty good in that last third of the stroke, especially right at the last few millimeters of the wheel path. And that should help with bottoming out too easily, which was one of the issues I had with the previous bike. Although the Ritmo is basically as progressive as the SB160, it's where that progression comes in the curve that caused the problems. The Ritmo is progressive at the beginning and fairly flat in the middle to last 2/3 of its stroke. So this bike should be better suited for this test. And now the shocks themselves are going to cure some of the complaints I had the first time around as well, specifically the Super Deluxe Ultimate. The Super Deluxe coil has an adjustable hydraulic bottom out with 5 different settings that will add just a touch more bottom out resistance than a typical coil shock would have. And that makes it so I can run a spring that's soft enough to really reap the benefits in that small chatter, but not just slam into the bottom of my travel on bumps that probably shouldn't require full travel. On the air side of things, the Vivid is a high volume air shock that's designed for enduro and DH bikes. That means it's burly enough for the application and a great match for the SB160. So while the test results would have been more drastic if I had used a Deluxe or a Super Deluxe, but I wanted a real world option that you'd likely find on a bike like this. Admittedly, it's going to be tough to tell these two shocks apart. The Vivid does its best to replicate the off the top feel of a coil shock, and it does a hell of a job at doing that. It features that same hydraulic bottom out control as the Super Deluxe, as well as a really cool position sensitive damper. But before we go ride, let's talk about the misconception that coil shocks somehow make your bike burlier or more capable, or they like add travel or make it just bigger. None of that is true. I see so many comments like, oh man, I put a coil on my shock and it's just so much more capable now. And that's just simply not how these things work. And I've got some facts to back that up. So it's time for math class. So I looked at suspension choices for riders in 2023 Red Bull Rampage, as well as 2023 World Champ downhill racing in Fort William. And I would argue these are some of the most elite, most rugged mountain bike events that are out there. They have some of the highest demands out of both riders and bicycles, but their demands are very different. And that becomes very apparent when you look at suspension choices for both of these events. So out of the 16 bikes at Rampage, 13 of them had air shocks, while only 3 had coil. So that's 81% of them had air shocks. And that's likely because bottom out resistance is the name of the game at an event like this. A rider can pack these full of spacers and make them ramp up really hard, which is gonna basically save their lives when they huck off of these giant cliffs. World Champ downhill, on the other hand, has very different demands. So we looked at 30 different bikes from World Champs, and 24 of them had coil shocks, and only 6 had air, which is the exact opposite ratio. 80% had coil, 20% had air. That's because downhill racing requires traction and speed through corners, so the preference for coil makes sense. That alone should be enough evidence to convince you that coil shocks just aren't better. I mean, is a Rampage rider better than a World Cup rider? No, they're just different. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Let's go ride bikes. So after getting both shocks dialed and taking a couple of practice laps on my trails so that I knew them, I mounted up the coil shock and I headed to the hills. I timed a run on one of my favorite mellow, chill flow trails with little jumps, a bunch of berms, and my time came in at 2 minutes, 46.9 seconds. Not only did I time the run, but I also made good notes about ride quality, particularly about the pop factor, bottom outs, traction, handling characteristics, things that the suspension will have a big influence on. And then I timed a lap on a rough and rugged trail with a wide mix of challenging features, It has everything: rough bits, high-speed straights, off-camber sections, rocks, roots, tight corners, flat corners, berms. And my time on that trail was 2 minutes, 41.8 seconds. Then I repeated the same laps on the Airshock. And my time on the flow trail was 2 minutes, 44.5 seconds. And my time on the rough trail, 2 minutes, 39.9 seconds. On the flow trail, I was 2.4 seconds faster on the Airshock. And on the rougher trail, I was 1.9 seconds faster on the Airshock. And I'm as surprised as you are to find that the Airshock was faster on both types of trails. Now, speed or a lap time isn't the only way to measure the difference between the two shocks. Not everyone's trying to be a racer, although it is a pretty good indicator of how well your bike and suspension are performing. A bike that's not performing well isn't going to handle well. It won't glide through chunky stuff, it won't provide traction in corners, and all of those things can be measured by a lap time. The fun factor isn't something I could measure quantitatively, so this is a bit subjective here, but if I'm being completely blunt and honest, I really couldn't tell too much of a difference in the playful factor or the poppiness of the bike between the two. The coil shock did a pretty good job of remaining lively, and I think a big portion of that was my setup and that hydraulic bottom mount control. So looking back at the footage, I was trying to find out why the Airshock was faster for me everywhere. And I do have a couple of theories, so hear me out. First of all, that Vivid is a pretty special shock. It is very good at replicating the off-the-top feel of a coil while maintaining the mid-stroke and bottom-out feel of an Airshock. And that allows for a coil-like traction, but without any wallow. And I think the higher you can stay in your travel while still keeping your bike from getting bounced around is the best way to maintain momentum and speed. So the Airshock did just that. It kept the bike calm and composed and stuck to the ground, but without ever using too much travel for any given impact. Now, the Super Deluxe still did an excellent, if not better job at keeping the rear wheel on the ground through the bumps, the corners, the off-camber bits. And I just think it got deeper into the stroke on any given hit. I didn't have any bottom out or wheel hang-up issues with it, but I just think it may have moved more than needed, resulting in slower times. And I did try to run it with a stiffer spring, but then I kind of lost the benefit I was looking for in that off-the-top feel. And we'll get into this in just a minute, but that's where, again, I think an Airshock has an advantage is in the setup. It's a little bit easier to get it absolutely perfect. My other theory is my test trails had some pretty tight corners, they had some flattish bits, and then even some uphill pedally section. And I think that is probably where the majority of that time advantage was made up. The Airshock is a bit better under pedaling and pumping forces, which allowed me to get back up to speed quicker, which kept my time's a little bit faster. So let's get into the takeaways. We're just gonna break this down into a bunch of different categories, try to pick a winner, tally it all up at the end, and help you decide which is gonna be the best shock for you. So coil versus air when it comes to setting up your suspension. And this one is a no-brainer. Air shocks are so much easier to set up and fine-tune to your preferences. It's as simple as connecting a shock pump, adding, removing air, playing with the adjusters, rinse and repeat until it's perfect. And then you can even take that fine tuning further with the simple procedure of adding or removing volume spacers. And then even just measuring your sag is more simple and easier to do on an Airshock. There's no spring getting in the way. If you don't have it printed on the shaft, you don't have to do any sort of math. It's just easier to do. To adjust your spring rate on a coil shock, on the other hand, you have to swap the spring out for another one. So that requires taking it off of your bike, throwing the new one on. It's also a little bit tougher to know where to start. So you might have the wrong one right out of the gate. So you're gonna have to go buy multiple coils until you get it right. And depending on the manufacturer, spring rates typically come in 25 to 50 pound increments, which can be maybe too big of a jump. Things like Sprindex will help you get that fine tuned, but that's just an extra bit of complexity to getting this stuff set up. It's worth noting you can adjust the ride height with your preload ring, but that does not adjust your spring rate. That just adjusts where you sit, or basically your sag. It's not going to change how your suspension behaves out on the trail. So now let's talk about off the top sensitivity, which is probably where one of the biggest performance differences is. Historically, this is where the coil shock has had the biggest advantage. So there's less friction to overcome, so it breaks free more easily, and that smooths out your small bumps better. Smoothing out your small bumps better is going to give you more traction. And that's why a lot of downhill racers are choosing coil shocks. And this still holds true even with these two specific examples. I will say the Vivid does a really, really good job of replicating what a coil shock is designed to do. It is probably the most coil-like air shock that I've ever ridden. So now let's get into the fun factor, and this is typically where the air shock has always won. Air shocks do offer a bit more mid to end stroke support naturally, so that's going to give you a little bit better pop out of the bike. And I'd say that's still true even with the Vivid and the Super Deluxe Coil, although just like the Vivid was very good at replicating the good things of a coil, the Super Deluxe is getting better at replicating the good things about air. With that hydraulic bottom mount control, you are able to fine tune that ramp up at the end, and that does go a long way in making the shock feel a little more lively. And that leads us right into bottom out control. And again, the air shock is going to be the winner here, not only just because of its natural tendency to ramp up, but because this one in particular has bottom out control and you can add and remove spacers. So you have a ton of control over how that last bit of your travel feels. The Super Deluxe Coil is better than most other shocks I've ridden, even considering coil shocks with progressive springs at controlling bottom outs and not blowing through the end stroke too easily. So now let's get into heat dissipation, which is kind of, a unique case because not too many people have downhills long enough that are going to really bring out any ill effects of an air shock overheating. I spent a couple of days riding lifts, hitting long descents, and I never noticed the air shock performing worse at the bottom of the hill as opposed to the top. I just don't think my descents were long enough. They were about 2,000 vertical feet, and I was going all day. It was middle of the summer. I still couldn't tell that it was performing worse by the bottom of the hill. But if you do have a 20-minute straight shot, let's say you live in Whistler and you're riding top of the world, that's a pretty long downhill. You might start to notice an air shock starting to suffer by the bottom of the mountain. Let's talk about climbing for just a second. I didn't do any timed climbs this time around. I've done them in the past and found that it really wasn't too big of a difference. With proper setup, both of them are going to pedal fine. Obviously, the coil shock weighs a little bit more, so there is a weight penalty there, which over the course of a really long day is going to be more noticeable, but it's maybe a pound difference between the two. And I don't know, if you can tell 1 pound on your bike, you might be pretty special. I would also argue that folks that are even considering putting a coil shock on their bike aren't the types of folks that are going to try to eke out every millisecond advantage on a climb. Now let's get down to this last one, which is the maintenance factor. And this is a clear winner for coil shocks because they have longer service intervals. You don't have to replace the seals, do air can services. So there's a way longer service interval and they just tend to be a little bit more durable. All right, so should you pick coil or air? As boring as this sounds, I think most people will benefit more from an air shock than they will from a coil shock. And I've got a couple of reasons. First, your bike probably already came with an air shock. So that means you don't have to go out and spend more money, don't have to buy a different shock. And it also means your bike will play nicely with it because it's what it came with. It was a shock that it was designed to run. Second, I think most people will benefit more from the merits of an air shock than they will from a coil. Air is easier to set up, and I'd argue that suspension setup is by far the most important thing to make your bike feel good. So if you get that wrong, your bike's not gonna feel good, and it's not gonna matter what shock's on there. If the setup is wrong, it's not gonna work. By being easier to set up, you're more likely to get it set up correctly, so advantage air shock. Yes, you can get a coil dialed, but I'm not sure if most riders have the patience or the ability to get it there, frankly. Air is also a little more well-rounded in terms of its performance, which I think offers more versatility, which is going to benefit more people. Notice how many times I just said most people. I understand that there are riders who fall under more extreme use cases. Some of those riders will be better suited with a coil shock. Otherwise, you wouldn't see the majority of World Cup DH racers on coil shocks. I get it. Those folks are elite riders. Their skill is at the very sharp end, and they need the bike to make up that last little percentage so they can land on a podium. I would argue that most of us don't fall into that camp, though. The average Joes that I can see being better off on a coil are the I only ride park folks. They've got big descents, so the heat dissipation will be an advantage. The maintenance and durability will also be an advantage. So at the end of the day, which one will I pick? You're gonna hate me for it. I'm sticking with air shocks. I see the merits of a coil. I like the coil. I have a coil on a couple of bikes. Most bikes that I ride, I prefer an air shock. And here's the kicker. Like I said, that Vivid is pretty special. So if you kind of like coil, but you don't want any of the negatives of it, I cannot recommend it enough. I would put that on every bike I own if I could. Quite possibly my favorite shock I've ever ridden. Anyway, thanks for sticking around. Tell me all the ways I'm wrong. I'll see you next time.